Apologies for background noise, I live in a built-up area. This video is to demonstrate wood grain on the lathe and some of the accidents that can happen, particularly on the scrap piece of wood here, when the grain is running across the wood like this and it's on the lathe like that. So there are two orientations typically for the grain. One is going across the lathe and the other one is going along the bed of the lathe, so the grain running this way. So we'll start with this one because it's the most troublesome, and I'll demonstrate some of the problems. I've drilled a hole in this piece of wood. I've got a homemade screw chuck here. I'm going to put that in there. It's a bit tight, but we'll get there. Right, that should hold. This is a chuck. As I turn this moves inwards or outwards. And at the moment I'm going to be expanding into this recess here, and that's what will hold this. So let's get that on there. So that's now solidly on there. I'm going to bring this over here, bring that up, check that it turns first before I switch the lathe on, turn the speed right down, and there we go. For this demonstration I'm going to be wearing a visor so that if anything flies off, hits this, I don't get it in my face. What you'll notice here is that these cuts are quite clean, but this one here, you can see the grain tearing up here. This grain is all broken up off the end of that, and here again it's a relatively clean cut, quite clean cut, and broken up. Because what's happened is this, when we cut like this, it's being supported by the fibers behind, whereas here there is nothing supporting those fibers. It's as if the fibers are being broken off like that. They've just been torn out, whereas when we cut in here, they're being supported by the fibers behind. So they cut off, whereas here they tear. And then what could happen is this splits right across. For the woodworkers, imagine if you were trying to plane this piece of wood. Forget that it's on a lathe, ignore everything else and just look at this piece of wood. You wouldn't have any problem planing that off. You'd be quite happy planing that off. But would you plane like this? Oh look, I've torn a piece of wood right off. You wouldn't plane like that, you just wouldn't do it. You always plane with the grain supported by the other fibers behind it. So the question then comes, how do you make something like this round? Because there are times when you want the grain in this orientation and not this orientation. Particularly things like bowls and plates. You wouldn't want a plate with the grain running, the short grain, thinly in the bottom of the plate, because the minute you put it down anyway it would pop right through. You need the grain running across the bottom of the bowl or plate. So how do you cut something like that? The correct way to cut something like that is to cut it from this side here. Rather than straight in there, you cut across the grain. Because what we could do, I can't do it now, but we could come across that grain to cut that chamfer, like that. I'm not doing a very good demonstration here, but I could come across the grain, and that wouldn't tear out. Not until the very end anyway. So a bowl gouge, this is a small one, allows you to turn into the end there without tearing too much off, what I'm going to do is turn this round like that. Great, my neighbour's vacuuming his car. And now when I come in from the side here, I'll be making nice clean curly cuts like that, even into the end grain, because I'll be cutting across the side of the grain. It won't be quite as clean as before, but it won't be tearing things out. I'll just demonstrate that quickly. That's a very clean cut here because the grain's running that way. This way the grain's running into it that way. But it's still a clean cut, even though the grain is running this way, because we've cut across the fibers and not into them. And that's key. I want to demonstrate the finish off the tool. You can see a little bit of ridging, the fibers coming up here just ever so slightly because the grain is running this way. But on the other side, where the grain is running away from us or up, we're cutting through the fibers with a lot of support behind. And once it's round, these fibers have a lot of support behind them because they're round. It's when it's square and you're on the corner and there's nothing behind that corner, that's when you find that things chip off or break right off. The other thing I wanted to demonstrate was the quality of the finish on side grain when you're using a scraper as opposed to a cutting tool. This is just a piece of scrap wood, so I'm going to start off by getting that round, and to get it round I'm going to use a roughing gouge. Now a roughing gouge is usually quite heavy stock. So it's got a heavy gauge as it comes through there. It's got a lot of support. This happens to be a huge rough and gouge. I turn it by hand first to make sure that it's clear. Make sure I don't get my fingers down in there. And the tool is on the rest before I go to the work. I can tell that it's not round yet because I can feel it as I'm turning. If I put the point beyond the piece of wood and put it down on the wood, I'll know if it's round, or if it bounces. It's not round. This is not quite round, it's bouncing a little bit. I'm using my fingers to judge the depth of how far I go. Just like I would if I was using a pencil, I would put my hand on the paper before I write. Writing without putting my hand on the paper is very difficult because there's no reference point. Your hand provides a reference point as you write with a pencil. The same thing happens with the tool. Your hand is your reference point on a fixed support. And then you have control over this. If my hand is back here, I have very little control, either sideways or forwards and backwards. I can use my fingers to make small movements. And now you can see that it's not quite round yet. We've reached a point now where there's too much gap here. Not only can I get my fingers between this, but with a shorter tool, I'm giving the wood too much leverage to pull this up out of my hand. So I need to move the rest closer to the wood. It's not quite round, but it's close enough. You can see the surface of the wood is quite rough at the moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a scraper to start with. Now this scraper is relatively sharp at the moment, and I'm going to make a smoothing cut with the scraper. Now that's as smooth as I could get that with the scraper. And on that camera you may see this as relatively smooth. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to smooth off another piece with a cutting tool, a tool that actually cuts the wood. Excuse me. This is a skew chisel. Now I'm going to bring you in and see if you can see the difference. If this is in focus, you'll notice the difference between the wood that was cut and the wood that was scraped. It's a lot shinier, and the reason it is because it's a lot smoother than this. This I can catch my nail on. This I can hardly catch my nail on. Now there are two reasons. One reason is this was cut with a tool. Oh, there's the neighbour with his hoover again. And behind the cut, the bevel of the tool, this shiny section here, the bevel of the tool was rubbing on the wood, pressing on the wood, supporting those fibres, but also burnishing the fibres behind the cut. So although the cut, which I can't do one-handed, was clean, it also burnished the wood that was left behind. Whereas this scrapes the wood away and leaves nothing behind there, just tearing it apart. This is like planing wood across the grain. You would never do that. So we plane with the grain if we can. What I want to demonstrate in very slow motion is what happens when you do this. Yes, it's taking wood away, but you're creating a lot of dust for a start. But also the quality of that finish is atrocious. Whereas, I'll try to do this one-handed, if you have this supported and you do this, what you're doing is cutting. So skew chisel cuts rather than tearing the wood away. So even there, turning by hand, you can see the difference. A nice smooth finish. And the benefit of a smooth finish is less sanding, which means less dust and less heat build up in the wood, which in very fine wood or pieces is important. One of the other major differences between cutting and scraping is the quality of the finished item after the tool is finished, or you're finished with the tool. And although you can sand a lot of the scraping away, you lose a lot of detail. So certain things, certain types of details would be almost impossible to do with a scraper. And I'm going to do a cove with a scraper, and I'm going to do a cove with a gouge, and you'll see the difference. Now I took the finest cuts I could with that scraper at the end, because rough cuts with a scraper end up really rough. So I've taken relatively light cuts with that to try and get the smoothest finish I could with the scraper. Now I'm going to use a spindle gouge. I don't know if you can tell the difference from this angle and with this camera, but this one is distinctly rougher. And now to demonstrate some other detail that you wouldn't be able to do with a scraper. This wood is quite soft, and you can see that little bit of wood is actually chipped off there. But there's no way you could get that sharp edge, that sharp detail, that feature with a scraper. Absolutely no way. And a lot of practical purposes, that would be sufficient. We wouldn't need to sand that at all, especially if this wood was being painted. There's absolutely no need. I'm going to take that off and try to get a closer look at the piece. So you can see the difference between what was scraped and what was cut with the wood. There's a vast difference in the finish. Well, I hope that was useful.